Hey, this is Melissa McClelland.
I'm Luke Doucette. We are Whitehorse.
And you are listening to Recess with Spinelli.
Ashes to ashes to dust.
You are tuned in to Recess with Spinelli here on WSPN, Saratoga Springs, Hoxton FM, London, England, the International Radio Festival, and the New York State Music Blog. And today we are here with the Toronto duo Whitehorse. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Most well.
Now, your new album, which is Panther in a Dollhouse, which is out for release on July 7th, you describe it as a microscope on domestic life. Care to go into some more details about that?
It actually came from a dream that I had. And I woke up with that line, Panther in the Dollhouse, and I thought, ooh, that actually kind of describes the music pretty well. This, there's something kind of tame and expected, but then there's something kind of sexy and dark that's challenging that as well. The microscope on domesticity. Did I say that right? Yeah, I mean, we like to think of it as like a bull in a china shop, but a little sexier than that.
There is the domesticity that she talks about, and some of the stories are sort of set up in an almost Edward Scissorhands-like suburban neighborhood mindscape. But and this is actually something that Melissa's always written that way in her writing. Myself, not to the same degree, but those kinds of stories of corrupted domesticity seem to be, and we've been mining those depths for a long time, I think. This record is almost entirely fiction. Like these stories, these characters, most of them are fictional. And of course we embody various elements of all of them because you can't help but do that as a writer. But this is not a record about us necessarily. It's not an autobiographical. The stories themselves are almost entirely fictional. And you're never entirely sure whether the person you're following is a protagonist or an antagonist. Like we don't necessarily endeavor to make that clear. It's ambiguous even whether or not you're supposed to like these characters. I'm not sure that we know or that we want you to know.
So do you enjoy writing fictional stories rather than autobiographical stories as if they're from a diary better?
I think the personal stories are pretty satisfying to write. But as a writer, I feel like it's a more interesting challenge to pull from other sources, whether it be my dreams or a newspaper clipping or a town that we're passing through or a conversation I overhear in a bar. I mean, I feel like there's so many different ideas and ways to write, and I think a lot of the time songwriters feel limited to their own experience, and I feel like it's important to be a little more creative than that. The world's an interesting place, and there's a lot that we can create out of thin air as well. So
at various stages in this record and the last record, in the process of writing these songs and building these records, we have, for the first time ever, just considered that part of our job is to be creative writers, almost as if we were authors or fiction writers. And we've become more comfortable with the idea of fiction. And this is part and parcel, I think, of evolving away from being solipsistic singer-songwriters into being members in a rock band, which we consider ourselves a rock band. I've often heard the adage that anybody can write a memoir, but only a good writer can write a novel that's fictional. And I think that sometimes when you're stuck in telling the truth all the time or telling your own stories, you're really just writing memoirs or regurgitating the same thing. That doesn't necessarily take a whole lot of creativity. It's a lot harder to write fictional stories, and I think a lot more satisfying if you do it well.
It's funny because sometimes the true stories can sound like the fake stories. My dad was a repo man in Compton in the 60s. And every time I say that, I'm like, oh, that's a song, but it just sounds like bull. Yeah, sometimes the truth is more fantastic sounding or cliched sounding, really. I think when you can carve stories out of nothing, sometimes you get to a more substantial truth.
So when you're writing a fictional story, do you ever find that you have to pull back a little bit, that you might be putting too much of yourself into a certain character or into a certain story arc?
I don't personally feel that way. There's a lot of liberation when you're writing fictionally, and whether you want to mine from your own experiences or mine from those that you made up, you're not encumbered by the idea that you have to tell the truth in a factual kind of way. I think there are philosophical truths, and there are ways to be truthful without necessarily saying things that in fact occurred. But I just think there's a kind of liberty in making stuff up that certainly is not challenged or threatened in any way by actually including the truth. It's just that nobody who knows or who cares if this part of the song is born of reality or not, and maybe some people do care, and in which case they may entertain themselves by trying to figure it out. I'm not so preoccupied by it.
Actually, what this reminds me of is, a lot of the music I grew up with, it was a lot of my dad's music from the 70s, The Who, Jethro Tull, and a lot of that, a lot of rock operas and a lot of fictional stories. And I feel like maybe it's not something you really hear so much anymore, or at least with a lot of the interviews I've done. It seems like a lot of musicians are definitely autobiographical. So do you find you are kind of diving into a niche here that hasn't been developed in a while?
I got tired of the navel gazing that, this is if this was, we've made a bunch of records. Melissa made 4 records as a solo artist, and so did I, and then we made 4 or 5 records as Whitehorse. I don't want to tell the truth anymore. My story's been told. It bores me to tears. And quite frankly, most of the stories that most people tell that are about themselves are pretty boring. And I think that there just comes a point when it's like something else has to give. And the idea that it takes real work to write fictionally, that has a certain resonance with me anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say it is, and this industry is narcissistic by nature in a way. So you do get a lot of people who are, writing from their heart and soul their own story and thinking that is the end all be all. And we want to hear that too. We don't want to lose that. But I think there's so much more to it. And there are artists definitely that we are inspired by that do that so poignantly and so incredibly well.
So actually, regarding the characters in songs, or even in stories really, what about flawed characters attracts people so much to them, as opposed to like a perfect Superman-style-esque person?
I think that people get a lot of solace from flawed characters for the very simple reason that we're all flawed. The idea of presenting perfect characters to people, I think, is less interesting, because I also don't think that people are looking for reassurance of that kind from the simple 3-minute pop song. I think what they're looking for is a microscopic inquiry into the darker corners of things. And maybe there was a time in the 50s or the 40s or the early 60s when optimism and joy and just the celebration of the good times was really quite exciting. But we're literally millions of songs into the project of rock and roll. There's just certain things that don't need to be said anymore, and I think that a certain kind of obvious perfection that you referred to it as a superhero type story, I don't think it's very compelling to people anymore.
Regarding the evolution of rock music, or just music in general, I was reading an article, I think it was like an NPR or something the other week, and they did like this graph and how music, over the past 50 years has definitely become more repetitive or has less unique words in it. Now you say rock is going in the same direction. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is it harder to express yourself with fewer words, or is it easier?
I think it's harder. Writing simply is always more difficult. I have a daughter, Melissa's stepdaughter, who's Chloe. She's 20, almost 21, and I see a lot of my own youthful writing in her writing, which is that she has a very hard time with 3 simple verses and a chorus, and her verses are crammed full of words, and she's got a million little stories and opinions and political perspectives that she's trying to get across in every song. And I did the same thing. I mean, she'll learn that lesson long before I did. But I think less is more, and it's more difficult to make do with less. Finding the simplest 3-chord song that everybody strikes their head back and goes, "Oh my God, that's so poignant and perfect. Why didn't I think of that?" You didn't think of it because it's really hard.
Both serve a purpose, and both are important. And people who can achieve both at the same time, that is like the brilliance. That is mind-blowing. But, our brains do want to hear something satisfying. We want to hear the bridge here, and we want to hear this melody go to this place. So there is something to be said for that kind of like predictable thing that happens that just makes us feel good, and music kind of comes down to that. But on the other hand, it's also, you can acquire a taste for these things, and it's good to challenge the mind and challenge the brain and push it to new places where it's kind of like first time anyone heard Bob Dylan do Bob Dylan, they're probably like I don't know, but then your mind kind of wraps around it, and it's like, yes, I want to hear more of this. So in order for music to evolve, you have to push those boundaries and challenge those expectations that we naturally have in our mind. And I do think the genre, like the indie rock genre, is getting like really, really tired, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here. I feel like it needs to go somewhere else, or popular music needs to go somewhere else. I'm a little uninspired by it recently.
Do you have any idea where you think it might be going, or anything that you've seen?
I'm of two minds. On one hand, I'm a little bit, I wouldn't say necessarily pessimistic, but maybe a little bit skeptical of what I see in the trend. I think that people naturally take the path of least resistance, and it's become so easy, facile, to make mediocre music. Anybody can do it with a laptop. So most people are, because why bother spending the time and energy to do something really hard, which takes a lot of time, when you can do something that's pretty easy and to the average person on the street is 75% of the way there anyway. So I see a lot of mediocrity passing as quality. But having said that, I know some young people. I talk about my daughter. She's working really hard, and she's got a lot of skills. I know some young people who are in their late teens, early 20s, who are working really, really hard, who are developing craft, who are really serious about being artists. So I think that I don't actually know where things are going, and I think young people are curious and clever, and are going to find some really interesting shit that we're not even aware of. On
a very general note, how would you describe the purpose of music? What role does it serve for humans on a very basic level?
I just finished rereading the book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which is like one of my all-time favorite books. Milan Kundera. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But there's a passage that he writes about music that I read and reread like maybe a dozen times because I just loved it. And obviously I'm not going to be able to quote it. It's a 3-page thing. But basically the essence of it is in a world that is so obsessed with words and speaking and noise, the music is kind of the antithesis of that. It's like the anti-word. It's kind of like rebelling against the spoken word, the sentence. And to me, I feel like it brings life to the spoken word. It allows it to take flight in a way. And so for me, there's kind of something very liberating in just being able to listen to music and the feelings that are produced from just listening to music or playing music especially. Yeah, I think there's something very cathartic and healing, and I don't think anyone's really immune to that, no matter what kind of music you respond to or what kind of music you listen to.
So, in essence, the difference between a fictional writer for a magazine or a book and a musician fictional writer is the energy that comes with it?
Yeah, one is kind of pure emotion, where the other is maybe more kind of introspective, intellectualizing, a little more noisy, which is funny because music is noise. But there's something just more kind of bass emotion about it. Like you don't want to think about it. You don't want to overthink it. You just want to feel it.
So that actually goes back to the concept of keeping things simple is the best way to get a genuine response out of people, out of your listeners.
I mean, I think that's true, although I still think that most of us fail at that. Most of us, and I include us half the time, we fail at it, where you overthink it, or you include too many filters and screens between your... when I see an artist that I really love, I often like guitar players. I like guitar players. I like all kinds of artists, but I have a soft spot for great guitar players. And there are a few people that I think have I always describe them as having really short cables. And I mean, like, it's almost like the guitar cable that they're playing with is the distance between their mind, their heart, their fingers, the strings, the cable, across the stage, into their amplifier, into a microphone, out into speakers and into people's ears. For some people, that cable is really long. It's 100 feet long. For other people, it's 6 inches. And those are the people that I think touch you in a way that's just, it's hard to define. I'm actually reading about Elvis Presley right now. He was like that. And he was a simpleton at best. But he had so much exuberance and talent. He didn't even know he had talent. He was just bursting with freshness and vitality and talent. But he barely had 2 neurons in his brain to rub together to figure out what he was doing. And that's great that he didn't know, because nothing got in the way. He was just expressing a completely raw, desperate, emotional, musical expression that was unadulterated in any way. We have moments of finding that, and then and I say we as Whitehorse, or just we, our friends, our records that I listen to at home. It's hard to allow yourself to respect the simplicity of a 3-minute pop song. We're naturally curious people, and we like to think we're smart, so we put in big words and big ideas and big themes, and all of a sudden it gets confusing. We could blame Bob Dylan for that to some degree, but I think he's a lot simpler than people think.
So at the end of the day, either in the writing, production, or the performance aspect, when do you feel that you've got it right? When do you get that satisfaction, that return that says, you know what, we're doing something good here and it's working out?
It has a lot to do with playing it on stage. It's one thing to listen in the studio and be like, wow, I think we really nailed it. But you can do a sales job on yourself just by wanting it to be good. But you play something live and you watch people's faces, or you listen to what they say, or what their body language, that you get a sense pretty quickly. And it's usually the first or second or third time that you play a song that you really know. It's amazing. You introduce a brand new song on stage, people have never heard it, and the energy is often palpable. And
before we head off and before you guys go on stage, are there any other final thoughts that you have, either about your album, the tour, or anything else that you think is important to talk about?
I'll state the obvious. Come out to live shows, support the music that you love, and show up. And live music is still happening, believe it or not, and it's amazing. And we hope to see you out there.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, guys.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Recess with Spinelli here on WSPN, Saratoga Springs, Hoxton FM, London, England, the International Radio Festival, and the New York State Music Blog. And we have been speaking with the Toronto duo Whitehorse, and their brand new album Panther in a Dollhouse will be out and available on July 7th.